Hello, my name is Stephanie Opperman. I am an associate professor of history at Georgia College. I teach world history survey courses, and I'm also the Latin Americanist for our department. So I spend a lot of time teaching classes on colonial Latin America and modern Latin America more generally. My particular area of interest is Mexico, particularly 20th century Mexican history and also US-Mexican relations. I do also teach classes on immigration, on Mesoamerican foodways, and in Central American and some South American history as well. I've been at Georgia College since 2013, and I graduated from the University of Illinois at Chicago with my PhD in history, with, again, an emphasis on Latin America. My dissertation actually looked at public health campaigns in rural indigenous communities of Mexico. So when I was at the University of Illinois at Chicago, I was working at the Institute for Health Research and Health Policy. And I was there during the day. I would kind of take my classes at night and Latin American history. And I started to put these two ideas together about how public health and history interact, particularly in living in Chicago at the time and seeing neighborhoods of, Guatemalan migrants or Mexican migrants, and sort of thinking about how to best serve their health practices and their health needs. And so that kind of opened the door into a much longer and more detailed study of public health campaigns in Mexican communities. And then based on my particular interest, I was also looking at rural communities. And I'll talk a bit more about sort of these campaigns as we get going with today's project, because they are related. It was while I was investigating sort of public health campaigns in rural indigenous communities that I came across the work of anthropologists from Mexico and also anthropologists from the United States, who were devoting time to going into these smaller villages, these more isolated rural areas of Mexico, and trying to, sort of help them determine what a successful public health policy or public health program might look like, how to engage the community, to have them involved in participatory well-being campaigns was a large part of what I was studying. And it was really interesting to learn sort of which communities responded favorably to this initiative that was being brought down, from the state or from international aid campaigns, and which programs or which villages had no interest in this. And that really had to do with sort of more long-standing relationships between communities and the state. And so Mexico is kind of a hotbed of activity in public health and in looking at anthropology and using that information to try to better serve indigenous communities. Now, was this completely altruistic? No, there's a development aspect that goes along with all of this, a modernization, industrialization, ideas that are at the heart of everything that I'm talking about. But I like to study kind of the individuals who are on the scene and in the moment, engaging with the community members, more so than the, sort of bureaucrats who are shuffling papers in DC or in Mexico City. So that's what I wrote my dissertation on. I had 3 different communities that I studied, and they each revealed, sort of a lot of variance in whether or not the community accepted the programs that were being implemented there. But while I was doing that research, I came across Isabel Kelly. Isabel Kelly is who I'm going to talk to you about today. She's someone who's been in the back of my mind since writing my dissertation, and I finally feel like I have enough research on her to tell her story. So I'm excited to kind of walk you through why I think she's an important member of international relations, of anthropology and archaeology, of international community development programs at the time, and in making connections with indigenous communities in the Southwestern United States and also in Mexico. And her travels will take her further afield from that as well. So I'm going to move to sharing my slides with you so that you can see a few pictures as I tell you a bit about Isabel Kelly. Okay, so the title of my talk today is Applying Anthropology Abroad, the International Work of Isabel Kelly. And I'm specifically looking at the time period from the end of World War II until 1960 when she retires. Isabel Kelly stood out to me in my research, both, again, it was on other topics, but then as I learned more about her, she became more and more intriguing to me because she is a woman who was kind of in the second wave of anthropologists that are developing a professional career in the 20th century. She is a young woman who is, kind of navigating a lot of what at the time was a pretty widespread male-dominated career path at the time. And I had a lot in common with her. She was born in California, where I happened to live for a while. Her family had 2 daughters, and her parents really encouraged them to pursue education, and not just at the undergraduate level. Both she and her sister went on to earn, graduate degrees in things of their interest. Isabel Kelly made her way to anthropology, which was a brand new field at the time, mostly because she had such a strong interest in wanting to travel and to immerse herself into other cultures and to learn as much about them as she could. She was a student of A.L. Kroeber, who was a product of the Columbia University, Frank Boas generation. She would have been a contemporary of Margaret Mead, who earned her PhD in 1927. Ruth Benedict would have come before that. So there were a few women who were kind of blazing the trail of anthropology, but Isabel Kelly earned her PhD in anthropology in 1932, so only 5 years after Margaret Mead. So they are definitely, sort of in the same generation. At Berkeley, she earned her PhD in anthropology by writing a dissertation on the fundamentals of Great Basin culture. And so she was really looking at the Northern Paiute and the coastal Miwok indigenous cultures of Northern California. And after she earned her degree, she decided to, continue pursuing other cultural anthropological and archaeological programming or opportunities as they were coming up in the Southwestern United States. So she spent time in California, Arizona, and New Mexico before kind of making her way to Mexico across the border. And so this is a picture of her. It's a little blurry, but I love it. It's one of the earliest pictures of her. And she is, kind of packing up her car and getting ready to go, kind of on a next big adventure, excuse me, on her own into the field to do, some field work. And this was just really her interest in sort of following leads where they would take her. She was trying to figure out what kind of job she was going to have after she graduated. She was, kind of working on these projects as an independent researcher. A lot of her advisors, Carl Saar and also A.L. Kroeber, would, kind of help guide her in, I've heard about this new project in New Mexico, and she'd go there and do work. And eventually that started making its way across the border. She started overseeing excavations in places like Sinaloa, Jalisco, Colima, and also Nayarit. And I want to pause right here and talk for just a minute about how important it was that she's doing these research projects in the late 1930s in Mexico. So Mexico at this time is a hotbed for archaeological and anthropological studies. In the 1920s, Teotihuacan outside of Mexico City and Chichen Itza along the Gulf of Mexico both, became international sensations when they were reconnected to the popular audience. What I mean by that is, I don't want to say that they were found or they were discovered, but I will say that anthropologists, there we go, came across them for the first time, right? They had been sort of buried or forgotten or not really discussed, and then they were rediscovered, or, a sort of new level of connection was found with them, and they became, really intriguing research places. The Mexican state really took advantage of this opportunity of having these sort of, international interest in their history. The Mexican population had just come out of revolution from 1910 to 1920. And so the combination of coming out of a revolution, needing to sort of think about how they wanted to create a national identity that the majority of the population could get behind. And then you have these sort of archaeological, anthropological discoveries, or, you know, re-encounters, I think is a better way of saying that, all work together at the same time. And so it allows the Mexican state the chance to, you know, make connections to their indigenous culture, their indigenous past, and sort of, excuse me, thinking about a rebranding campaign as far as a national identity goes. And then in the 1930s, which would be the time where Isabel Kelly is, you know, coming onto the scene, we have, you know, one of the most forward-thinking progressive presidents, Lázaro Cárdenas, who's president from 1934 to 1940. And so there's a lot of change. It feels like sort of this momentum is building for including rural communities that had previously been left out of the very cosmopolitan, you know, Mexican center. You can see on this map, there's a little red dot kind of in the middle here, of Mexico City, the Mexico DF, which is the capital. And then everything kind of ruminates out, you know, from that, both to the north and to the south. And so really bringing these large, you know, remote areas of the population into an inclusive version of society that celebrates an indigenous culture, you know, this is a great time to be an archaeologist and an anthropologist. And so, like I said, she's kind of at the hotbed of all of this. So my book project looks at Isabel Kelly. This is her, you know, sort of standard issue employment photograph, but she rarely liked to have photos taken of herself. So here she is. And she really made a name for herself in anthropological circles by the work that she did in the Southwestern United States in the 1930s. So all that work that she did in California, Arizona, and New Mexico, that really gave her a lot of recognition. And in anthropological circles today, a lot of people know who she is from that experience. But what I want to talk about in my book project is her international work, because that part, for whatever reason, has, you know, sort of yet to reveal itself to a larger audience. And for me personally, I think this is where stuff really starts to get interesting. So, you know, here she is. She's going to be in Mexico in the late 1930s. In the 1940s, we have the sort of end of this very progressive president. We're moving towards much more conservative times again. There's also a push for rural development. There's also a push for industrialization and modernization. There's also a world war that's taking place. And so, you know, there's Cold War relations start to get into the mix of things. There's a rise and change in what the role of anthropology could be or do. And there's also a rise and change in international development programs. And Isabel's work really kind of finds itself in the heart of all of this. So, as I mentioned, Isabel Kelly had started making her way to different parts of Mexico for short-term research projects. This was usually kind of done under the guidance or the networking of her dissertation advisors, who are still keeping in touch with her. But beginning in about 1945, she starts to transition from an independent researcher to more of an international social anthropologist. And one of the ways that that happens is that she gets a job at the Biblioteca Benjamin Franklin. This is in Mexico City, so it's in the capital. This is an OIAA, Inter-American Affairs initiative to have a library with a lot of English works available in Mexico City. She's very good friends with the librarian, Bertha Harris, and Bertha is able to help Isabel get a permanent job at the library. This means that she's going to be able to move to Mexico and work there permanently. She has a connection, you know, very loosely with the United States government through this OIAA initiative. And she's allowed to go out and pursue the types of research that she's most interested in, which for her is the, sort of deep dive that she's going to do into some of the indigenous communities in the area. And she becomes quite famous for the work that she'll do on the Tarascans and the Totonac. So both of those, sort of really capture her attention right away. She starts spending more and more time out there, and she's kind of establishing, a career path for herself through, sort of having the Biblioteca as her home base. So that's in 1945. 1 year later, 1946, her colleague, George Foster, who she knew through graduate school, he was a few years ahead of her, but they had kind of an informal connection. He reached out to her with an opportunity to start teaching at Mexico's National School of Anthropology. The school had not been around for very long at that point. They were looking to help expand the number of well-trained anthropologists in Mexico, and they were looking for, sort of outside contributors to help them, kind of fill in this void and, train the next generation of anthropologists. And this is very appealing to Isabel. And she agrees that she'll start teaching. And the way that this is done is it's kind of under the umbrella of the program that George Foster's running at the time, which is through the Smithsonian Institution. So through the Smithsonian, there is an Institute of Social Anthropology that is doing a lot of, global work in the 1940s, particularly, like I said, after the end of World War II, in trying to develop better cultural and educational programs. So Isabel Kelly agrees to go to work, again, it's for the Smithsonian Institute of Social Anthropology, but under that umbrella, one of her primary responsibilities will be to teach classes at Mexico's National School of Anthropology. So it's kind of like a dream come true, right? She's gonna have access to several research opportunities. She's funded by the United States. This is a full-time permanent position, and she's going to be able to teach. She's going to be able to take graduate students into the field with her to do sort of community research, and this will also help her kind of stay on top of the latest research that's coming out in the United States and around the world. So a lot of my research about Kelly is going to come from this pivotal relationship right here. This is a key moment when Isabel Kelly and George Foster agree to start working together. They will write letters to each other for a good bit of the rest of their lives. A lot of them have been preserved in the National Anthropology Archive, which is part of the Smithsonian. There are some information or some letters that are also part of the Isabel Kelly Ethnographic Archive at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And in addition to this sort of copious amounts of correspondence that really lets you know her personality, both when she has to present herself professionally and also in sort of the for your eyes only notes that she will write to Foster, and that he also writes back to her throughout the rest of their public tenure in these positions. In addition to those, I do also have information from, the National Archives and Records Administration, sort of State Department records. Because she's working with public health campaigns for a part of this, there's a lot of information at the National Institutes of Health. And then in Mexico, they also have an ethnographic library that has, some of her publications and findings. And then finally, the Secretaría de Salubridad Asistencia, which is the Department of Public Health in Mexico City, they also have some records pertaining to her work as well. So I use all of this information to sort of gather the story that I'm gonna, kind of briefly try to share with you now. I will also say that Isabel Kelly, among her many qualities, is an excellent photographer, and the Smithsonian has actually had a couple of different exhibits of her photographs over time that she was able to take from these rural communities and kind of bring back and show the world sort of the encounters and experiences that she was having. And so I'll present some of those in this presentation as well. Okay, so in 1946, Isabel Kelly begins to work with George Foster. She is one of the team members in Mexico working for the Institute for Social Anthropology. And within a year, George Foster is promoted, excuse me, to oversee the entire Institute of Social Anthropology. So not just in Mexico, but all of the Smithsonian's programs around the world. So he gets a big promotion. As a result of that, he promotes Isabel to be the sort of chief of the Mexico team. So she very quickly signs on to be a field party member and, you know, an instructor, and she moves from that, still having those responsibilities, but now also overseeing all of the team members who are doing similar work in Mexico. Life runs along from 1946 until 1949, and then the Smithsonian program meets its first hurdle. Because in 1949, Truman introduced his Point 4 program, right? So President Truman is going to reconsider how he's sending, or his administration is sending members, you know, US members, US intellectuals into communities throughout the world in an effort to help train them, educate them, anything related to that. And he decides to, you know, initiate the Point 4 program. What that means in plain terms is that the Smithsonian Institute for Social Anthropology goes away. In its place is the Institute for Inter-American Affairs, the IIAA, and that will now become under the umbrella of the Department of State. So this is done in a very specific and calculated effort to bring ideas of economic development, of, you know, rural urbanization, right? Industrializing rural areas and trying to bring them, you know, into what they were considering the modern fold, and to really promote sort of US ideas and ideals in a Cold War climate. For our main character, what this means is she was working for a library, then she found herself working for the Smithsonian and being a teacher, and now in a very short time period, she's a member of the Department of State and is working for the Institute for Inter-American Affairs. Now her day-to-day tasks don't change that much, but you can imagine, you know, sort of the mental shift that she's having to take in the kind of work that she's doing and the kind of outcomes that are expected of her in these positions. So it is a transition from, let me go into a community and learn the language and learn the customs and try to come back and share that information in a way that is meaningful to policy advocates, to instead, let me learn specifically about things like public health, potable water, sanitation, and housing needs of rural communities, so that I can make very specific and concrete suggestions to international funding and international development programs. One of the first things that she's asked to do is to complete an evaluation of 2 health centers in Mexico City. One of them is the Beatriz Alemán Center, and the second is in Xochimilco. And so this is a map of the sort of sanitation plan of Xochimilco that was in Isabel Kelly's files. And in comparing this neighborhood with the communities the individuals in the community who chose to participate in this public health institution or health center versus the Beatriz Alemán Center was really revealing and showing the depth of how she was able to take an anthropological background and apply it to very practical evaluations of things like public health centers. So she was able to critique and, you know, comment on variances in funding, and variances of community support, and variances in the type of programmings that were being offered, and how these were all largely based on the preferences of the politicians and the funders who supported this program, rather than on what the communities actually needed, right? That she was finding that it was really hard for both of these programs to actually attract community members or attract patients and encourage them to come in and take advantage of the initiatives being offered here. I think this really speaks to, you know, local political climates at the time, the lack of funding, the lack of community engagement, and the rivalry that's taking place, not only within the different ministries in the country of Mexico, but also between Mexican health officials and anthropologists and US health officials and anthropologists. I did write an article about the evaluation that Isabel did of the 2 public health centers. And I'm just posting that information here if you want to read more about it. But for now, I'm going to use this as kind of an example to say that, you know, she's really kind of having to shift the types of things that she's studying and the way that she's looking at communities into more, you know, sort of medical anthropology, looking at folk medical, you know, treatments and traditions, and seeing how people use medicine or relate to medicine and health and disease and what those terms mean in these different areas. And then, you know, sort of also how to develop things like malaria eradication campaigns, particularly because, and I can't stress this enough, Mexican rural communities had been so isolated and so removed from the central state that they had been used to taking care of themselves. And so now to suddenly have Mexican politicians and foreign anthropologists show up and say, oh, don't worry, like what I have in my vial here, I'm gonna, you know, stick into your child's arm and it's gonna make them feel much better, and they're gonna be healthy from here on out. That's a hard sell. And, you know, so Isabel Kelly is really trying to lay the groundwork and lay the foundation for, you know, helping to bridge medical programs, development programs, things that the state and the US government and Department of State are interested in, with ways that the community will understand, appreciate, accept, acknowledge, incorporate, engage with. And, you know, she's one of many who are doing this, but I find this work fascinating. So she, you know, she starts being part of, you know, what the Department of State is doing in, you know, sort of rebuilding or rebranding their development initiatives as being forms of international cooperation, and really trying to create community centers that are focused on the health needs and the economic development of rural communities in a way that will engage the communities, ideally. So I'm going to pause here and show you, these are a couple of pictures that Isabel Kelly, you know, took as she's visiting, you know, lots of communities throughout central and northern Mexico. This is a corn mill. Everyone is kind of taking their corn to be ground and to turned into masa. So this is a central station for where the women would go and do this. Here is, you know, sort of a scene of bathing that the women and the children are doing. And, you know, here's an example of, you know, sort of making tamales and, you know, being in, you know, kitchens, making meals for, you know, a large group or a large community. It's really important also, I think, to notice that Isabel Kelly spends most of her time with the women and, you know, kind of acknowledges that they are the head of the household. They are the person who's making family decisions about whether their children are going to go to school, whether they want to go to a health center, how they want to deliver their child. You know, all these sort of questions that get at the heart of public health programming happen with the women. And so she's going to spend a lot of time, you know, sort of in that environment. And another article that I wrote looks at one of these campaigns called the Bienestar Social Rural Project, which was in Veracruz. This also has, you know, it relies heavily on the work of Isabel Kelly. And, you know, it's talking about how she's really trying to foster a new relationship between Mexico's Ministry of Public Health, the National Mexican School of Anthropology, and, you know, the work of the Institute of Inter-American Affairs. She's wanting to, you know, sort of take advantage of the fact that as a woman, it's a little bit easier for the women in these communities to talk to her. She also wants that to be, you know, something that has a bit of a legacy to it. And so Isabel Kelly gets particularly excited about finding women in Mexico City who want to earn graduate degrees in anthropology and bringing those women, those female students, into the field with her to study local women's responses. In the case of the Bienestar Social Rural program, you know, she really wants to know, like, how these women feel about the opening of a public health center, of a community center in their town. And because of the more frank conversations that are able to take place among this group of women, Isabel Kelly learns very quickly that the women are largely disinterested in many of the well-being programs that are attempted in this environment, that, they feel like they already know a lot of the things that are being taught, like how to prepare a healthy breakfast, or, how to make sure that you've bathed your child properly, or, how to make sure that your child is staying healthy, with, disease in the area. And to be an outside program, right, to be coming in from the Mexican state and offering these services to the moms, a lot of the mothers are feeling like, what's the point of this? I already know how to take care of my child. Surely you're not arguing that I don't know how to take care of my child. And so Isabel Kelly, has conversations with them and says, like, what is it that you would like instead? And, they say, we want to learn how to sew so that we could be, sort of professional embroiderers. We want to learn typing. We want to learn how to tell time. We want to be able to teach our children how to do these things. And so she's able to, really bring that information back to policymakers and politicians in Mexico and convey the significance of including the community in your planning, right? You can't just dictate from on high and think they're going to, immediately say thank you. A lot of them feel it's unnecessary and they have no reason for joining. So you need to find things that are going to entice them. And the only way to do that is to actually talk to them and to let it feel like it's a community building project. So that's one of the messages that Isabel Kelly is bringing back to Mexican politicians, Mexican anthropologists, and their US counterparts, because again, she's kind of the bridge between both of these. Got a few more pictures here that she's taking in these communities of, again, children, mothers, families, and looking at, sort of housing and dress and, who's wearing shoes and how often they clean and what it is they eat. Here's an example of, sort of a weaving. So she's looking at cultural connections, but also, sort of how they're making their livelihood. And this is just, I find it to be an amazing resource of moments that she's capturing. So the Point 4 program starts in 1949. It goes through various waves and shifts, but by 1955, it's done. The Institute for Inter-American Affairs is going to change names again to become the International Cooperation Administration. This is also through the Department of State. Isabel Kelly stays, under this umbrella again. But as the IIAA and Point 4 shift, the International Cooperation Administration and the State Department shift again. And in fact, part of the reason it gets the new name is because the State Department wants to make it very clear that it's moving away from public health campaigns, and it's going to start focusing more on agriculture and economic activities. So those are going to be the development initiatives that the US is going to start offering to other countries beginning in 1955. What this means for Isabel is that she'll be using applied anthropology, again, to sort of help make very practical programming decisions. And again, mostly based on agriculture and on economic activities. Applied anthropology by this point is gaining traction, not only in US circles, but also among many anthropologists in this period in Mexico. And so that's going to lead to a new layer of cooperation between Isabel Kelly and anthropologists in Mexico. And just kind of in the background, while she's making this transition again, sort of away from health and to agriculture and the economy, she also decides, she's going to permanently reside in Mexico. She's been building a house on the periphery of Xochimilco in an area called Tepepan, which now is kind of in the heart of Xochimilco, which is kind of a big suburb of Mexico City. So it's hard to imagine that it was this rural, remote place. But I do have, I'm going to show you a few more pictures first. This again is a wedding scene. Sort of laying the foundation of building a thatched roof and also visiting ruins. So just a few of the many, many pictures Isabel Kelly has taken. But now I'll show you, this is a picture of the interior of her home. Once it's completed, this is where she's going to write and research for the rest of her life. You can see she's got an expansive library. She also starts to collect a lot of artifacts. Here's, sort of a pottery room that she had in her house. And a lot of these things will either be donated to the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City or the Smithsonian. So you can still find a lot of these items that she preserved and wanted to make sure made it into museums from all of her travels. While this was her home base, she was also asked to start traveling outside of Mexico. She knew Mexico very well. She had trained anthropologists in Mexico and US anthropologists in how to effectively do the work that she had been doing for a while. And because of her expertise, the State Department wanted to start sending her further afield. So she kept her home base in Mexico, but she visited a couple of other places. First, she went to Puerto Rico. She went there to inspect community development programs and to record suggestions for, what was working well and not well there, what might she be able to bring back and help implement in Mexico. But it's interesting, in her letters, Isabel Kelly is not really impressed with Puerto Rico. She likes the sort of ancient civilizations and ancient traditions and customs of Mexico, and she's just not sort of finding that same historical lineage or connection to the culture that is on the island. In 1958 and 59, she makes two different trips to Bolivia. One, again, the State Department is shifting towards agriculture and economic engagement, but it's also shifting from wanting to work in the 1940s with making as many allies as they could with stable political environments like Mexico, to now in the 1950s, late 1950s, wanting to devote their attention to more unstable political environments and to try to be the bridge or help stabilize those areas. And so Bolivia kind of becomes one of the test cases for that, because it is in the late 1950s a very unstable political climate. She goes there to study the possibilities for trying to relocate unemployed miners from Bolivia's Oruro Hills to the lower hill valley of the Yungas. She also goes back a second time to give a series of health education talks in the capital of La Paz. So she has two different experiences in Bolivia. I have a colleague, Dr. Nicole Pacino, who's at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, who's written a lot about her time in Bolivia. And then shortly after that, in 1959 into early 1960, she travels to Pakistan, which is another, sort of unstable political climate that the US government would like to improve relationships with. And they're using this international development umbrella as a way to do that. So Isabel goes there to start conducting studies on community development and learning about handicrafts, and also in paying attention to the food habits of the communities that she's studying. She gives several lectures highlighting the benefits of incorporating anthropological studies of culture within developmental assistance programs broadly. However, with the travel and with the kind of expectation that she's going to be on the move a lot more, and that she's going to be learning about, water hydration and well systems and seeds and seed protection and sort of all of this new layer of agricultural and, again, economic industry paths, she becomes less interested in this. This is moving herself too far away from her passions, both the ones that she originally started her research with and the ones that she developed in health and in, sort of folk traditions. This is kind of taking it to another level. She's getting older. She has a lot of research that she's been excited to put together. And, the travel, while it does offer her a chance to explore new cultures and see new places, which she does like, she's realizing that this is a lot of work on her part, and the actual influence, which some of you may be asking about, the influence that she's having on policies is still pretty small. She's kind of beating this drum everywhere that she goes and having some effect, mostly on getting professionals to continue thinking about how to incorporate community development and community culture into their programming. But it's not like these programs change overnight. It's not like she's seen a lot of tangible results for all of the research that she's done. So in 1960, she decides to retire. She's going to resign from the Department of State. Here's a picture of her kind of later in life. And she wants to really focus on her own research at this point, right? She continues publishing and completing research projects from her home in Tepepan, Mexico for the rest of her life. From 1960 to 1983, which is the year that she passes away, she'll write 12 more articles, 3 more books, and still continue to travel and give regional lectures from time to time. So she stays very engaged and is writing, you know, up until the last. So this is my very condensed portrait of Isabel Kelly. I will close by saying that I think that the significance of her international work is valuable and worth studying. She really helped to expose the human realities that are at the heart of development programs, whether state officials think they might be or not. So while national leaders may prioritize economic and hemispheric alliances, true communication, cooperation, and community engagement can really only come with a greater understanding of and appreciation for cultures that exist in that space already. Admiring, appreciating, learning about, and celebrating the traditions of those regions as the first step towards collaboration is really the heart of what Isabel Kelly's research shows. It did help to inspire future applied anthropological research. It did help to really foster relationships between anthropologists in the US and Mexico. And it really did kind of set the tone for, you know, future versions of State Department relationships through the 1960s and out from there. So I want to thank you all for listening to my talk on Isabel Kelly. I hope you found her exciting, engaging, something worth studying about, something maybe reading a book about someday. I have on my slides, which I will go back to. I closed out just a smidge too early because I do want to thank you all and to share my contact information. So if you have any questions, comments, ideas related to Isabel Kelly and her research, please do reach out. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.